One of the companies that I've always felt had the best grasp on gamification in the enterprise was a Canadian startup called Ripple. And evidently I wasn't alone. Salesforce.com recently acquired the company. I sat down with Daniel Debow, who was the CEO of Ripple and is now the head of the division at Salesforce, to talk about how he sees some of the challenges that we've talked about in the class around applying gamification techniques within an organization. Hey, Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here, Kevin.
So why don't you first tell us a little bit about Ripple, your company?
What Ripple really does is amplify behavior. And it focuses on goal setting and coaching, so encouraging people to set goals as a team, as an individual, as a group, and get coaching from their managers and from their peers, to get recognized for doing great work. So a really simple, easy way for people to say, hey, you did a great job, and help that become part of people's reputation. And an easy way for people to gather feedback. And that could be something really light, like, hey, I want to learn how to what's one thing I can do better as a speaker after a meeting I just went through, all the way up and into something much more like a traditional performance process done every quarter, every 6 months, and sort of ways to manage that at scale. So basically it's social performance management, and it's a modern approach to helping people work better together.
Mm-hmm. So why gamification? Why are these kinds of game mechanics valuable in the kind of context you're dealing with?
So but I should be honest. One of the things that we never set out to do was to build a game. And even though I hired game designers and people who built large-scale multiplayer alternate reality universes, we never really used the word gamification or making it a game at all. I mean, really what we were thinking about was just design. How do we design a great experience? And as we were designing it, we were thinking about people, things that people engage in, where they would have natural affinity to get rewarded or not get rewarded, to compete or not compete. And very carefully, we started to add these elements in. It was only after the fact that people came to us and said, hey, you guys are gamifying this. And we said, oh, sounds good. Okay, if that's right. But we were always very careful and thoughtful. We were really careful. Interestingly, the game designers on my team were very careful of let's not just be slapping, leaderboards and badges and game mechanics on everything. There has to be a good reason. And the very simple argument, and I think it's totally compelling, was that if all it took to make a compelling game was to slap game mechanics on it, then every game would be successful. And we know that to be not true. Most games fail. And it's because the underlying gameplay, the underlying thing that you're measuring, is not itself intrinsically rewarding. So the argument we made is that gamification, to the extent we use the term, was really only for amplifying things that were already good or already behaviors people want to get going on. So that's how we thought about it. And I can give you examples of where we did and did not do it.
Yeah, well, why don't you say a little bit more first about how do you find those things that are intrinsically rewarding? Because it sounds great, but I assume it's not obvious where that's the case.
Yep. That's true. I mean, well, sometimes it is obvious, sometimes it's not. I mean, I think the two things we would say is look at the data and then also look at behavior. So data, so one of the first things Ripple allowed people to do was to ask for feedback. You have to go in and say, what's something I can do, and gather anonymous feedback. And some people engage in it, lots of them, but it's not a sustained behavior, and not everybody will engage because it's frankly a little scary. And we looked at the data around how people responded, and pretty obvious. People like to give feedback. They're very happy. So we sort of just asked the question, what if we could make giving feedback the core of the solution? And then the question is, well, how do you design that so it doesn't become people giving negative things and making people feel bad about the feedback they're getting? Later on, we wanted to manage that experience in different ways. And so that goes to the second point, which is just observe behaviors. And the behavior we observed was that people would send emails to each other all the time saying, hey, great job, Kevin, let me copy your boss. Or they would have a company meeting, or if you walked by people's desks, you would see that they would have physical tokens. They would have basically badges of symbolic measures or metrics of their achievements. And the key thing for us that we figured out was, no one really cared about the badge, or no one really cared about the thing. It's the meaning that they attach to it. That's what makes it intrinsically valuable. And in the case of recognition at work, it was the fact that you were getting your peers to say what you did mattered and what you did was important, and in a way that people understood, others would understand the symbology of what that recognition was. So maybe an easier way to think about it is, or way we used to think about it, was that if I gave you a piece of purple ribbon and a piece of metal and said, here you go, most people would be like, thanks. But if you told them that that was a representative of something, you only got that if you were wounded in action in defense to your country. That was the Purple Heart. People would treat this little ribbon with a piece of reverence all of a sudden. And all that's changed is the meaning of that thing, not the thing itself. And so how we found those things is by looking for where do people engage in these behaviors in real life. And I think, by the way, this is pretty common amongst game designers, certainly in social software design. I mean, if you look at Facebook, the two core activities that started were in real life behaviors, like people writing on their dorm room walls semi-public information, and people looking at physical Facebooks. And the thinking there was, how can we make that more efficient? So in our case, we saw people giving each other recognition, adding little symbolism to it, and we had the data about how they were using our feedback app. And so we simply said, well, what would happen if we make that the first thing? You come in and you just give someone recognition, you can give them a badge. And I guess maybe the third point to your how do you discover them is you experiment, right? So look at data, look at what people do, and then try things. Because many people spend a lot of time hypothesizing about how people will behave, and you don't really know until you try.
Mm-hmm. What's different fundamentally employing these kinds of mechanics and approaches in an enterprise situation inside a company versus some of the more external marketing, customer engagement kinds of examples?
I mean, I think lots is different. So lots of things similar. You have to experiment, you have to try things, but you have to be conscious of the social construct that people exist in. So let me give you an example. Rewards typically drive behavior, right? If you give people rewards, and specifically money, that often drives increased behavior. So one of the most common gamified rewards in spreading a product, Dropbox kind of used very well. PayPal also familiarized, which is the double-sided incentive. Basically, go introduce your friend, we'll give them $10 and you'll get $10 too, and lots of ways to track it. And so we wanted to do the same thing inside of an organization. Because Ripple was a freemium app, any manager could come in. It didn't have to come in through HR department. People could sign up, start using the product, and we wanted them to spread it. And so we said the same thing. We'll give you $25 or something like that. In fact, an even higher number than the $10 because a customer for us is so valuable. And we'll give them $25 just to start using it. And we ran a test of that behavior, right? That should make the thing spread like crazy. There already was a natural invite your friends. We wanted to just make it go more. Let's add this reward, explicit reward to it. And what we found counterintuitively was it made people use it less. As we asked more, it was because people felt extremely uncomfortable inside their company endorsing any product for money. It completely tainted the thing. And they were just like, I'm not willing to do that. It has to be good in and of itself for me to expend social capital, because that's what I'm really giving. It's not the money that I get. So that's maybe one example of understanding the context of how people use these tools. The second is their willingness to engage in frivolous behavior or seemingly frivolous behavior is heavily dictated by the culture of the organization. So I was talking about this example of how people can use Ripple to create a meaningful badge, give their own iconography, their own meaning to it, and then send it to someone. That behavior is going to depend a lot on the corporate culture. What's interesting, though, is how people not only are their willingness to spread, but also their willingness to moderate their behavior. So what might work externally might not work internally. One of the most common examples is people are concerned that they're going to give too many badges. They're going to go crazy. But what happens is inside companies, people moderate their behavior because they're very aware of the fact that they're at work. Other people are watching. They're doing something publicly. So they're much more calculating, I think, about their willingness to engage in behaviors that might be seen as deviating from the norms of that culture. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned corporate culture a couple times, and you talked about how you have customers like Facebook and so forth, technology, startup-y types of companies. Do you think that these mechanisms and gamification more broadly can work in traditional establishment companies as well?
Yes, for two reasons. Uh, Well, for three reasons. First is companies like Facebook and LinkedIn, while everyone saw the social network movie, like having spent time with those folks, it's an extraordinarily driven, focused, business-like company, right? I mean, it's 5,000 plus people filled with some of the top technical and business operations people from the Valley. It's moved out of the Harvard dorm. It's a real company like any other. It's a lot less different than people think in some ways. That said, it definitely is not, an industrial company from the Midwest. But the second, to answer your question, so first, correct the misnomer. Second is we have already lots of customers who have less famous names. That's why I don't mention them. But they're like, unionized, trade show companies or advertising agencies. They're, all have embraced Ripple and use it. And the third point is we are constantly getting inbounded now from the most established, biggest companies in the world because they're interested because they also feel